oh yes, God of the demand to enjoy. Sorry, I'm recording now. Is that I've had the question asked, yeah, why this religious interest? What's going on there? And one way of describing it is to say, well, there is a type of religious demand. A demand, like religion arises in lots of different ways. You could talk about nationalism being a type of religion. You can talk about, so religion can be described quite widely, and you can say this demand to enjoy is like the God that we experience today in the contemporary world, which is different from previous epochs. But now you really do get a sense of, like, especially in the West, this notion of trying to be fulfilled, optimized, and having everything that you could possibly want, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's lots of problems that arise from that. So I touched on some of those last week. I'm going to do a talk on it next month. But I'll, in terms of the concept, I'll do this superego, right? So with the connection with the God of the demand to enjoy, the God of prohibition. If you weren't there 2 weeks ago, the basic idea is the God of prohibition is this idea that we are all divided. We're all what's called castrated, which means all of us have had to give something up to be alive. When we come into the world, we give up this feeling of oneness with our mother. We give up this sense of being in the womb, like oceanic oneness of whatever, and we enter into this thing where we can't really get full enjoyment. We have to get substitute enjoyment. I think I talked about how we do that in many ways. Like, it's not just kind of enjoying a beach. It's also taking a picture of us being on the beach and enjoying the enjoyment of people seeing that we're on the beach, or the enjoyment of sharing life. Like, that's the interesting thing about us as human beings, is private enjoyment isn't really very enjoyable. That there's that story of the pastor who lies every week to his congregation that he's helping the homeless, but he's really playing golf. I'm sure most of you know this story, but basically every week he lies to the congregation, says, I'm feeding the homeless, I'm doing my work on a Sunday, what are you doing? But the truth is, yeah, he's just going to the golf club, playing 18 holes, and God finds out, and God decides to play a trick. So one week he goes down to the golf course, and the pastor takes a swipe at the ball, hits it, and first one goes into the hole in one, right? First, whatever you call it, hits a hole in one. Then he goes to the second, gets another hole in one, and he gets a hole in one right through to the 18th, because God is helping. And then God withdraws, and the angels say to God, like, what were you doing? Like, we thought you were going to punish this guy, but you gave him the perfect round of golf. And God says, but who's he going to tell? Who's he going to tell? Right? So the idea is he's been lying to everybody, so he can't tell anybody he had this perfect round of golf, because then everyone would know he wasn't helping the poor. So actually, the perfect round of golf isn't something wonderful. It's deeply painful because you can't share it, right? That is a psychoanalytic insight, that we don't have private enjoyment, right? We can have a certain amount of private enjoyment, but it's always infused with another, with doing something in front of another. You obviously see kids who are always going up to their mom and dad, so look at me, they want you to look. And so the God of prohibition is the idea that we've given up something to enter the world. We are all now in relationship getting substitute enjoyments. So now I'm connected to you. The baby doesn't have public enjoyment. The baby is at the mother's breast and then falls asleep, right? That's kind of private enjoyment. After the incest taboo, after you basically have to separate from the primary caregiver, now you're in the public world, and now you're kind of can never go back to fully private enjoyment. Even if you are privately enjoying, you might be fantasizing about people knowing that you got a high score in the computer or whatever it is. So we're now in the public world, we're interconnected, and we all had to give something up. But we fantasize one exception, and this is God. God is the one exception. Or it could be somebody else, our father or mother or person, some exception, but we're all We're all castrated, except for one. That's the God of the of prohibition. The God of the demand to enjoy is this notion that we can be whole and complete just like God. We can kind of like that. None of us need to be divided. None of us need to be in antagonism with ourselves and each other. And there's a way to overcome that through enough money, fame, drugs, sex, whatever it is. That's the God of the demand to enjoy. And so those were the two things that I was talking about 2 weeks ago. And then I talked about in terms of radical theology, and this is where theology comes in, that there is the God who is also divided, right? So there's the God who is not divided, but everybody else is. There's the God where God's not divided and neither are we. Hypothetically, we can all have wholeness and completeness. And then there is the God who is also divided just like us. And the name of that God, I would say, is crucified Christ, right? The God who experiences death, a kind of a certain kind of like death within itself. There's a really powerful message to that. And I'm not going to get into what that is necessarily right now, but it is basically the core of everything we do in Power Theology. So obviously it's the kind of thing that wholeness and completeness isn't even something that, oh, it would be great if we could have it, but we can't. I was talking to somebody yesterday and they said it like that. They said, well, some of your work, Pete, is like, it's like, well, we can't have that completeness that we would like. But I was like, well, it's not quite that. It's not like, oh, we can't have it, so we have to live without it. It's like, no, it would be horrific if we could have it. That's the radical insight. There is no radical insight to say that we're all struggle and have to face death and difficulties. There's no radicality to that. The radicality is if somehow you got rid of sacrifice, if somehow you got rid of struggle, you would simultaneously get rid of the utopia that you're imagining lies on the other side of it, right? The utopia is a fantasy generated by the struggle. And there's something radical about saying that there's an unhealthy, but there's a healthy form of sacrifice. There's a healthy form of struggle that is actually part of reality itself, part of everything. And somehow we need to be able to live into that. And that will be helpful on a personal and a political level. Okay, so that's a summary of what I was talking about. And then I'll say one thing about the superego then, is superego is a little bit different from conscience. Conscience is connected to the God of prohibition. So conscience is kind of like that feeling that you should maybe be nice to somebody, you should be kind, and maybe you didn't. Maybe you chose to do something selfish instead of being kind to your neighbor, right? And you've got conscience, which kind of like makes you feel a bit bad, makes you reflect on that. The superego is a little bit different. The superego is connected to your enjoyment. So the superego is the thing that actually beats you up for not having enough enjoyment, for not doing enough fun things, for not being social enough, not having enough friends, not going out enough. So I could say it like this, like conscience is a type of, it's connected with you basically giving up what you should do ethically for your pleasure, right? Conscience giving up what you should do ethically for the sake of your pleasure. The superego is connected with giving up your pleasure and making your pleasure your duty. So whenever a psychoanalyst like Zizek says the superegoic conjunction to enjoy, what they're saying is today we don't really live in the world of conscience as much. Obviously we have conscience, but we more live in the era of superego, that when you're looking on Instagram and you're seeing all these people having fun and you feel really bad, like you're missing out, that's the superego. The superego is connected with this beating you up for not having enough pleasure, for kind of sadistically telling you off for being boring, for what FOMO, fear of missing out. That's the superego, right? It's kind of beating you up with FOMO. whereas conscience is something a little bit different. Okay, so there's something, because I promised I'd give you some content, but can open it up, and anybody want to ask anything about that or take us in a completely different direction, all is welcome. William, jump in.
The way you've presented these things, and forgive me, this is a bit of a meta-analysis, is very much in terms of transactional language. We have this to get that. We don't have this, we want that. And I was just reflecting on that language and wondering, is that an accidental or a deliberate thing on your part to present these ideas in transactional form? Or is it just what we do as part of our culture? I think the classic example in Christian theology is penal substitution. That Jesus did this so we can get that, so we don't have to do this and we can do that, and we are substituted. And when you look at those kind of theologies and the ideas you're presenting in a transactional form, maybe we miss something a bit deeper. And I don't want to get too much into it, but that's, is transactional language deliberate from your perspective and what you're presenting here?
Okay, so I need to think about it exactly in what I was just saying there, but I will say it's like, you're absolutely right. Like one of the issues for me with this desire to get rid of sacrifice is that's a desire to get rid of something non-transactional. So sacrifice and gift are two non-transactional modes of being. So a gift is obviously non-transactional because you don't get something in return. The perfect gift is you give without return. And then sacrifice is also a giving. I mean, it's a type of gift, right? Because to sacrifice something is to buy a pint when you're not going to get one in return or whatever. It's a non-reciprocal, non-transactional, non-economic thing. So what you're saying is very, very key, is that for me, basically, if you get rid of sacrifice, you get rid of what makes life meaningful, and what makes life meaningful is precisely non-transactional ways of being in the world. And every society has them. Like even the most exchange-oriented society has all these rituals of gift giving, like bringing a bottle of wine when you go to a party, or baking a cake for a birthday, or presents. Like every society has to have, or buying a round of drinks, like in Ireland or whatever it is. Every society has to have certain forms of non-reciprocal activities, because I would say is if you got rid of them, you would get rid of meaning entirely. So I don't know if that's connected exactly, but what you're saying is very important, because I would say theologically speaking, again, this is one of the things, is we're trying to sensitize ourselves to non-transactional ways of being in the world. So, does that connect with what you meant at all?
Yeah, I think it does, and I've been challenged in terms of thinking about the transactional language we do and we use in terms of my own thought patterns, because I think when we start talking about transactions, we actually sort of we kind of poison ourselves and put a material value on everything, and I'm trying to rewrite my brain, if you like, and try and remove some of that thought pattern, that language, because I think it's actually helpful in terms of relating to one another. So it mirrors what you were saying, I think. Yes.
Oh, jump in, Courtney, and then Chris.
So you say you get rid of sacrifice, you get rid of meaning. Why is that? Like, what is it about us humans that makes sacrifice so absolutely vital?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you think about it, is like there's that people say like you sacrifice for what you love, and that's very true. We sacrifice for the people we love and for what we love, but there's also another side of it where you can turn it on its head and say you love because you sacrifice. Like I mean, on a very superficial level, I don't know if this holds or not, but one time we were talking about this and I thought, well, having a kid is an interesting example, because there's so much sacrifice even before the kid arrives. I mean, the amount of, physical, bodily difficulty to bring a kid into the world, and the savings that you have to do, and all of this sacrifice that has to happen, it's almost like, it's not that's why you love the kid at all, but it's almost like the amount of sacrifice is when the child comes into the world. There's this deep love, like they're connected. That's what I'm saying, they're dialectically connected, the suffering, the sacrifice, and the love. So maybe why is it? It's funny you're asking that, because kind of like it's so infused. I mean, desire itself is about lack. You desire what you do not have, and whenever you get something, your desire for it can diminish. That's why in love, again, there's a certain sense which you don't have the person that you're with. There's a certain amount of unknowing and adventure, and so the desire is maintained precisely by not having. So these are just giving examples, but it's almost like that without lack, there's no space to breathe. If you get all the money you want, if you get all of the whatever you want, and there's no gap, there's nothing in it except for full presence, it's suffocating, it's destructive, it destroys. So I don't know, does anybody else have a better way of describing it? But I'm kind of describing how, like, the very earliest point of the infant is whenever desire erupts for Lacan, the moment that the child is separated from the mother. So there's no desire before separation, like they're one, and it's kind of, there's something going on there, but it's once the separation happens, the child can desire the mother. And also, but if the mother is too over proximity, if there's too much over proximity, if the mother is everything to the child and the child is everything to the mother, then desire doesn't have a chance to kind of breathe and to move. So even I would say, from when you see it in children, is their desire to be around their parents, but also it can be suffocating, and their desire, they're learning to desire other things. So, but I don't feel I've explained. I think I've just given more examples. Do you want to come back on it? Ask me.
And no, I mean, that definitely gives me a lot of food for thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
So without lack, there's no desire, and desire is what drives us.
Yeah.
So basically, if we had no sacrifice, we'd be like the Eloi in the Time Machine, the H.G. Wells novel.
Oh yeah.
They had nothing, everything was provided for them, but all they were was cattle being fattened for the feeding.
Yes.
So they had no sacrifice, they had no desire, so they had no humanity, basically.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And psychoanalytically, you can call this, or sometimes it's a form of melancholy. And you can see this sometimes whenever someone's completely successful, they achieve everything that they wanted to achieve. There's this melancholy that's connected with kind of with getting everything, with having everything, that's actually, itself deeply, you could almost say depression is the sadness of not getting what you want, and melancholy is getting it. It's like they're both have this weird kind of suffering. Now, by the way, if this is the case, then one politically can say the problem with contemporary society, one of the many problems, whatever, is to simplify, is that, well, there's loads of sacrifice goes on in society. Loads of people sacrifice, have shit jobs, don't get paid very well, et cetera, et cetera. They're sacrificing huge amounts, but they don't benefit from the sacrifice. That's the problem. The problem isn't the sacrifice. The problem is it's not that we're all sacrificing and we're all benefiting from the sacrifices. We're all sacrificing, and a few people are benefiting from the sacrifice, and that's not even good for them. But it's definitely doubly, triply not good for the people who are sacrificing. So in this model, it's like, instead of us dreaming about a society without sacrifice, it's more about dreaming of a society in which we all sacrifice, and society benefits from that.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here too, I think that there's also an element that's, we're sort of socialized in this way, like in our society, where we tend to think the bigger the sacrifice, the greater the value of the thing, right? So the more money I spend on something, the more inherent value that I think it has, whether that matches reality or not. But I think, and it might be related to the super egoic thing as well, which is that we live in a society of abundance, and so you see people do things to try to create more boundaries when there aren't any. Like we can get coffee from coffee pods now, right? Like you can get a Keurig and have a cup of coffee instantly. And now you see people going out buying French presses and fancy things that, it takes 10 minutes to make a cup of coffee, and I think that in a way that's sort of this urge where like we find no joy in the K-cup anymore. Yeah. So we have to go through these rituals of buying expensive things to create more, making the more coffee difficult. And in the end, I mean, maybe it tastes a little bit better or whatever, but I think that's more psychic than anything, and I mean, I could go on and on about that with all kinds of different things, but I just think that that's kind of an example.
That's a brilliant example. I mean, that's the kind of, the hipster thing. Whenever hipster stuff happened, it was mostly, well, culturally, it was the attempt to make things more difficult again, to bring back enjoyment. So like everything, whether it was riding a bike and somebody would ride a penny farthing or whatever, or making coffee in a very roundabout way, or going back to vinyl and listen and buying records and doing all and so in one sense for me, hipsterism was partly an attempt to bring meaning back to a society and a culture that was lacking meaning. And the way hipsters did it, which is very ingenious, it was in a sense to make things difficult again. And by either in terms of temporality, so as you say, it takes 20 minutes to make a cup of coffee, or in terms of cost, or in terms of building something like building your own bike or whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's a great example. Sawyer, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah,
sorry as well.
Yeah, I actually wanted to. I'm very interested in how this conversation relates to perhaps the ways in which if like the paramount value is enjoyment or happiness in our society, the ways that's either intentionally or unintentionally weaponized by the workplace. I think like a few examples that just have been coming to mind through this is at a conference I was working at a little while ago, there's a business guru there, and they were talking about how don't give your employees bonuses anymore because there's scientific proof that bonuses don't make employees more happy. It actually makes them want more of a bonus next year. Give them company swag. Which of course is really interesting because in the tech companies, I think company swag has become almost like the equivalent of like wearing your shirt that says I work at Facebook, or I work at Guild or whatever. Like I'm just thinking about the companies around here in Denver, where you're like you get a satisfaction from participating in the company's marketing campaign.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting because other people see that you work for this prestigious, but of course you're kind of like locked in this thing where you think you want to work for these companies and you put on their garb and their clothes that's been replaced. Like that used to be your bonus and now it's your company swag. So it's just very interesting how these ideas kind of relate to the tech industry and other like philosophies around making the workplace more fun and more enjoyable, but it's actually a lot more exploitative in a way. But we are even seeing sometimes higher salaries and things like that, but we're also seeing longer work days. And like, my girlfriend, for example, she keeps having these meetings with her boss and she's like, we just want you to be more passionate and creative. Like, why can't you find, like, they're trying to, like, they want, like the workforce wants all of our sort of joy. Like they want us to find meaning and happiness, but of course it's being reintegrated for capital. And so it's like they're taking some sort of idea of meaning and finding meaning in work and trying to like rope it in, and they're roping it in some ways through I think the super egos thing that you're kind of talking about, where you're wanting what you think other people want.
Yeah. There's my favorite comedian, or one of them, is David Mitchell, but he on his quiz show, he was talking about in America how shopkeepers and stuff shop staff are always very friendly and very nice, and in Britain, in the UK, they're not. You go into a shop and like they'll just be ignored. No, and David Mitchell said, you know, being like it's bad enough you have to work in a shop, but like to be happy as well. And I said, and he says, it's the sign of a moron or a liar if you're happy. But it's like, oh yeah, like not only, yeah, of course I have to work in this shop. Yes, I have to work and I have to feed my kids, but I'm not going to be happy about it, you know, like, but you want my happiness as well. It's a straight, this is extra demand, you know.
Yeah, and I just think it makes me think about the ways in which, of course, like how we approach, you know, getting out of happiness as a paramount value is a total different question, but just like the idea of questioning, like, if I feel happy about this position, that's not necessarily always a good thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
That idea.
Yeah.
So I wanted to jump in here again because I'm so like just really interested in what you were just talking about, because I think you're onto such a huge thing like with our society, because you know, again, it's like we're the sort of the injunction is that you're supposed to identify with your job, enjoy your job. It used to be just kind of like the understanding was you would go to work, you know, put in the sacrifice. It's a little bit of like a prohibition, like you're supposed to damper your own desires, go to work, get a paycheck, come home. Now it's a whole different ballgame. And in a way, and I think Zizek talks about this, it's almost more totalitarian, right? It's almost like and I believe, Pete, you've talked about this in the past. It's like parents with their kids, you know, the parent is like, who says, get in the car, we're going. That's somehow less repressive than no, you should want to go. You have to, you know, want to go see your grandma or whatever. That's actually a little bit more, you know, traumatic and, you know, totalitarian in a way. And I think that's such a huge part of what we're dealing with in society today.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And what Greg's referencing there, that's a Zizek example I've used, but he says about basically if you've got a kid and you have to go to see grandma, and the old school parents, the conservative parents say, you got to see grandma, and the kid says no, and they say, get your coat, get in the car, you're going to see grandma. But the progressive family will, you know, sit little Johnny down and go, you have to see grandma, and you know, you really want to, don't you? You know, you're a good boy, and you know you'll make her happy and you'll make her smile. And Zizek says, you know, this is doubly terrible because one, it's a lie, because if the child says no, I just want to play the Xbox, they'll go back to get your coat, get in the car, you're going. And then secondly, not only do you have to go, you have to enjoy it. Like the first kid can go, but can at least have a fantasy space where they go, when I'm old enough, I can do whatever the hell I want. But in the second example, there's no space for rebellion, because the parent is trying to colonize the child's inner space with enjoyment. And that, I love that example because it's a beautiful, very kind of funny way of seeing the difference between the God of the demand to enjoy and the God of prohibition. And as Greg said, the God of prohibition in a job is like, no, you're not supposed to like your job. It's crap. But we all have to do, you know, we all have to do a bit of work, and you go in, you do your thing. To today, it's like, hey, let's have the conference where we all got the swag. We're all wearing the Facebook logo. Hey, we're all happy here, aren't we? We love this. You go like, not only do you have to work for Facebook, you have to bloody like it. You know, yeah, there's something even more oppressive about that. Yeah.
Hey, Pete.
Hey, who's that? Oh, is that Derek?
This is Derek. Yeah. It just kind of reminds me of a saying that I heard a while back, where, again, the paradox is that compliance is more dangerous than rebellion.
Yep. Compliance is more dangerous than rebellion. Yes. Okay. There's a few ways I can interpret that. Do you want to say anything about that? And
well, there's tons of different, you know, applications. You know, you could apply it to a child. You know, if you don't let the kid rebel, he never becomes an individual. You could also apply the concept to governments. You know, if we don't have rebellion, we don't have Bonhoeffer. You know, I mean, so we can go anywhere between a kid and like massive governments and still apply the concept, I think.
Yes.
I mean, and I think that, and then spiritually too. I mean, if we just comply religiously, I think that's the most dangerous space to live in as a Christian.
Yeah.
You know, unless we can rebel against this God, we'll never know him. it's that kind of thing.
Yes, no, that's brilliant. And Israel means to rest with God. There's also, I'll give another reading of it, which is fun as well. Is this idea that radical compliance can really be disruptive as well. So sometimes in workplaces, when you're not able to go on strike, what you can do is go by the letter of what you have to do exactly and do no more, right? And so you completely comply. And so an example of this Zizek uses is when he was a student, they did this. There was, and he's from Slovenia, and there was the communist government was in power. The communist government would win every year, right, by like 90% or 80%, but everyone knew it was fixed, right? Everyone knew it was fixed, but no one questioned it. Everyone pretended it was free. So what Zizek and his friends did was very clever. They had this student magazine, and what they did is they did this big thing in the run-up to the elections. Who's going to win? Free elections. It's all to play for. Like, none of us can predict in advance what's going to happen, right? And then on the day of the elections, they came out with a special edition. Communist Party wins. Who could have imagined? They were brought in by the KGB. The KGB sat them down and said, "You've got to stop doing what you're doing." And they were like, "Doing what?" And they were like, "You know what you were doing?" And they were like, "Well, it's a free election, wasn't it? Like, we didn't know who was going to win." And they're going, "Yes, it's a free election, but stop it," right? In other words, what they couldn't do is they couldn't say, "It's not a free election. We all know it's a piss take. And you guys, by basically being overly sincere and kind of like being so sincerely believing that it's a free election, made everybody laugh, because everyone's laughing because everyone knows it's not a free election," was even more subversive. So there's this, just dialectically, there's a really interesting thing where for sometimes complete compliance is a way to rebel. But anyway, that's a second.
No, that is, yeah, that's really awesome. I haven't heard many people talk about that, but it's a fascinating way of influence.
Yeah.
And the way I like the metaphor I use when I teach people that concept, because it's a hard concept to teach, to be honest with you.
Yes.
But the metaphor I use is, go ahead, give the dog the bone, but then shove it down his throat. Like,
yes.
give him what he wants, but make him choke on it.
Yes.
And it can be used, and I like to suggest that it can be used for malicious. I mean, you can use that kind of thing, but if your motive is, it all comes down to, is it manipulation or is it influence? It all depends on the motivation.
Yes.
If the motivation is good, trying to murder somebody's not good unless you were, unless you were Bart and Bonhoeffer,
Yeah.
right? And then all of a sudden now murdering someone might have been the best thing ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's and one quick funny story about that. Horrible thing to tell on myself about. But I remember when I was much younger, my wife desperately wanted me to play games with the kids. And I just, this is not me. I just couldn't stand the whole idea of it. And finally, I just complied. I'm like, every night I'm going to come home and I'm just going to play games with my little kids, And certainly there's nothing wrong with playing. It's just not who I was, I'd much rather help them with a math problem or something. And so I came home and did it. And finally, my wife was like, "Okay, please stop.
Yeah.
Enough's enough.
Yeah.
This isn't really, compliance doesn't really work here."
Yes.
So
yes.
anyways, that doesn't say a lot about me, but it is an example of kind of the situation.
No, absolutely. And there's a few more examples just very quickly, because this is a very, like Derek said, like it's a very, it's actually a very rich vein to understand. Is all societies basically have implicit transgressions. So for example, if you're at Eton Public School in the UK, which trains up royalty and politicians, it's all about respect, equality, being sober, being non-pathological in terms of like not about your enjoyment, but learning how to govern. But then you will have like these places where you get drunk and are terribly awful, and little secret societies which are all the opposite, right? And it's not that these are opposed, it's actually this secret transgressive space is precisely what enables this to keep going. And if you take away the transgressive little, like, so it's even like going to work. You go to work at the all week and you act very professionally, and then at the weekend go out and get drunk or whatever, and you've got this transgressive bit is actually what enables the other thing to work. Or a society that says we're all equal, but the implicit grammar is that some people are treated worse than others, whoever that is. And actually affirming what is said, but not affirming the transgressive underbelly, the transgressive grammar, is actually what can destabilize that system more quickly and more easily. So anyway, there's lots of ways you can apply this stuff, but it is interesting that basically there is always acceptable and unacceptable transgressions. That's basically what it is. We're all allowed to go over the speed limit. There's acceptable transgressions, and then there's unacceptable transgressions. And any system will have its acceptable, unacceptable behavior, right? And so maybe the office party or whatever it is, there's the acceptable, unacceptable behavior, and then there's unacceptable behavior. And the problem is, for example, if we're fighting a system, they will have a allowed form of transgression, and if we do the allowed form of transgression, it's not transgressive at all. Anyway, but these are just ways you can start to apply these ideas.
Yeah, I want to jump off that because I think it ties into some like, and just to go back, because I'm just on this like, tech company kick right now, but like the office party is a great example. Kombucha and beer on tap, that's free in your office. Like, you used to go to the bar and like talk shit about your boss. Well, now it's like, no, drink in front of with your boss do it for free. And it's like they're trying, like, bringing the idea of what the space of like venting is, like, as a space into one of the floors of a corporate building. There is still the secret, like, unmentioned transgression though, which is now you can't talk about how much you hate the boss that you're supposed to love that gives you free beer and will drink with you. Like, it's like but there's still something there. It's just hidden.
Yes, it's just hidden. Yeah. Oh, yeah. An example of that. I mean, you say you're in the tech industry. Like, in tech industry, from what I can tell, and this is bigger and bigger everywhere, is like, you don't talk about your boss probably as your boss. You maybe use their first name. Like, they dress like you. You kind of. So in other words, on the surface, you're all equal. Oh, don't call me, Dr. Rollins. Call me Pete, right? And we're all equal. And so that's on the surface, but the underlying grammar is, I'm the boss and I can fire you if I want, right? Now, if you actually so what you do in at work, of course, to survive, is you pretend that we're all equal while you understand that you're not equal at the grammar. What's more radical is pure compliance, where you treat your boss completely as an equal. Now, you'll get fired really quick, but it would be like, walking into his office anytime, sitting down, putting your feet up, going, I don't think I'm going to come into work tomorrow, mate, because, I'm going to go and have a few beers with my friends. Hey, we're all, it's all fine. You can do that whenever you want as well. You're going to get fired very quick. So it's a good example of how all these corporate structures have, they're kind of acceptable transgressions and unacceptable transgressions.
Yeah, and just quickly, that almost seems like a really good, more actualized example of like symbolic order versus superego, like something where there's the external, and then now it's like it's still there, but it's self-governed prohibition or something. But
yeah, because there's almost something like, I mean, we're all just riffing here, but it's really fun. But like the old school where you called your boss the boss, and they were dressed differently, and like there's something more oppressive of that, but you can have an internal space of, again, kind of like of resistance that can maybe create something that would go somewhere. But in this new thing, where you treat your boss as an equal and you call them by their first name and stuff like that, there's less inner space for the resistance. But this is why Zizek loves the first commandment: you shall have no other gods before me. Because he reads it, and I think there's some Jewish people who read this very literally, which is God saying, yeah, you can do it privately behind my back. Just don't do it publicly. You'll have no other gods in front of me. But yeah, of course. So it's like your parents saying, don't get drunk in front of me. But they're going like, yeah, of course you're going to get pissed with your mates. That's fine. We'd be disappointed if you didn't. But hey, you know, like in front of us in terms of what you do, like you're going to, you know, you're not going to get drunk. And so the idea is that within Judaism, there is a space for an internal resistance that can then be used against God. But whenever in Christianity, confessional Christianity, God becomes so internalized, there's no space of rebellion. So yeah, I think there's really interesting secular forms of that. Here, by the way, Chris, you did put up your hand a while back. I don't know if we've moved on from the conversation, but.
Well, this does take it back a bit, but you were talking about fear of missing out.
Oh yeah.
And I was thinking that, to my mind, that is largely based on mimetic desire, which, considering that we're also talking Lacan talks of the mirror stage, and that is mimetic. Can you weave mimesis back into what you've been saying?
Yes. Okay, I can, and see how technical this gets. If it gets too technical, you know, whatever, this is why you're here. And that you asked the question. So, well, what I think Lacan says is, right, he makes a distinction between what he calls the ego ideal and the ideal ego. So when the infant is looking in the mirror, this is the ego ideal. Their ego, they look into the mirror, and maybe it's the mirror of their brother or their sister, but they kind of see mimetically someone else, and they see that as an ideal. They bring that ideal into themselves. An ideal ego, it's really annoying, the terms are so similar. I always worry that I'm getting them the wrong way around. The ideal ego is whenever, it's not that I'm looking at the ideal, but that I feel myself being looked at by the ideal and being judged by it. Now, the reason why I'm making that distinction is because my understanding of Lacan is that the God of the demand to enjoy is the ego ideal. That's the imaginary. That's, you're looking at some other that's like yourself, who you admire or you're jealous of or you're in conflict with in some way. God as the ideal ego is an external force that is judging you and questioning you and looking at you. Both are about mimetics, but they have slightly different, one's imaginary, one's symbolic. I think I can basically, what Lacan is saying is conscience is at the level of the symbolic and superego is at the level of the imaginary, but they're both mimetic. But in these two different levels. So if I put that in a nutshell, it's like the God of the symbolic God is this external authority in which we're orchestrated, the boss who says, right, you have to do your work, you don't have to be happy about it, right? We're orchestrated. The imaginary God, the ego ideal God, is the God who is like, yeah, it's called me by my first name. We're all in this together. We're all having a great time working for Facebook and whatever. And yes, and that's the difference between conscience and superego. The conscience is connected with the symbolic God. Superego is connected with the imaginary God. There you go. Does that? But it's all mimetic. It's all mimetic, like Chris was saying. So mimetic desire is just the idea that I learn what to desire through looking at what you desire. There's a thing called joint attention. I think it's the point when a child can start to see what you're looking at. There's a point where basically the child can begin to see your desire alighting on something by the way you look at something else. And so the child starts to name the things that you're looking at through where your eyes are going. And that's kind of mimetic desire, is the child starts to desire what you desire because they desire your desire. All of that's connected to all of this. Yeah, so it's very important.
So is that, oh,
go for it.
Just real quick about the mimetic and desire. I learned what to desire by looking at what you desire. Is that what we do with the last guru, if we can find one?
Yes, exactly. Kind of, yes. So the last guru, which I'm glad you brought that up. That's kind of, I really enjoyed exploring those ideas. Is that Well, or do you mean that, like, basically, you know, somebody comes to a guru, for example, because they think that person has the answer, they have a
Yes.
certain desire, and then the last guru is the one who disinvests them of that notion.
Yes.
Yes. So do you want to expand on that at all, or is that, because I think they are connected?
Well, I'm just thinking that if I come to someone that I'm approaching that person as my guru, my mentor, I think they've got it all together. They know the answer.
Yes.
Whatever the question is, they've got the answer.
Yeah.
And I start to invest in that person. I'm trying to, I don't always have the words for this stuff. I'm trying to figure out what it is they want, and then that way I can mimic that, and that'll fix my life. And then the last guru would be the person who finally helps me to see that I don't actually need a guru, because there is no one who has the answer. You know, there is nothing that's going to fill the gap, satisfy the desire. So the mimetic part comes in with me trying to imitate what the guru does, or imitate how the guru thinks, in order to fix my life. And then at some point I have to grapple with the fact that the noun form, the mimesis that I'm engaging in, is not going to fix things.
Yes, I mean, that's beautifully said. I mean, and the basic thing is, once you're engaged in transference with this religious leader, with this guru, the last guru is the one who shows that their desire is divided as well. Because what you do is you go, and we all go, almost thinking that the other person has a substantive desire. They have something, they have the answer, it's substantive. And so the last insight is when you realize that, oh, they are divided as well. So they're desirous. In other words, the guru is also divided, is also non-substantive. And the trick is that doesn't get rid of, obviously, mimesis. So that's a basic structure that just kind of how we desire. But what hopefully happens is we start to desire itself, right? Instead of desiring the end of desire through some completion, we somehow become more comfortable with the fact that we're all desiring creatures, but there's no substantive endpoint to that. And so, yeah, the last guru is, for me, the one who enables that existential insight.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you. Was somebody else going to pop in there?
Yeah, I was gonna, Chandler. I was gonna ask a question. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, and it kind of came up in this conversation as well, is how you talked about, you know, there's no like private enjoyment, but it seems like so much of like modern capitalist society like really plays into that fantasy. It seems like so many things are like seeking for the private enjoyment. Like, even I have like a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and even like, you know, where we live, you know, there used to be a lot of like public parks, and now there's a lot of like, you know, more like rich houses, and so there's less public parks, and there's all these private parks that are, you know, behind people's fences. And there seems to be like this movement towards that kind of fantasy of, oh, I can have a private enjoyment, and it really seems to be rampant. And so my question is, like, how do you shift the access back to the public? Is that the right term? Do we want a public enjoyment, or is there something else? Is there a different way that the public is, maybe enjoyment the wrong term, or is it the right term? But how do we shift that access?
Yeah, no, that's very good. I mean, because there's a real, I mean, and to be honest, the basis of liberalism as a philosophy is basically atomism, is that the idea that we are individuals first who enter into community. And so there is, at the very basis of liberal philosophy, this notion that say we are individuals who then are part of community, whereas I think it's the exact opposite. Is an infant is part of a community before they have any sense of selfhood. It's not like we're at the side of the pool and we jump into the pool of community. You know, as you know, it's like, no, we're already in the pool, and we become a self very gradually out of this kind of the other, out of the other. So we're connected with the other inherently. But you're exactly right. And one of the reasons why I think the fantasy of private enjoyment is so rife is the God of the demand to enjoy. One of the things that comes out of this, and Todd McGowan's book, The End of Dissatisfaction, is brilliant on this, but is that it generates jealousies and envies. So it generates a real hatred of the other who is enjoying while you're not. So it creates social fragmentation. It frays social bonds. So a society of the demand to enjoy will increasingly there'll be more and more social strife and breakdown of social bonds. That's why actually a reactionary conservatism is always, I mean, I would say always, and I was trying to say this to Elliot in the last podcast we did, is like, it's not that some sort of reactionary, let's call it fascism, but I mean that not in the way it's thrown about, but that a reactionary force just happens to arise. It's the response to the anxiety that's created by the society of enjoyment. We want to reestablish prohibitions and we want to reestablish boundaries, because the anxiety of the superegoic demand to enjoy is too much. That's why the acid heads all became Jesus freaks, right? That's why you always, hippies always end up being fascists, give them 20 years. It's just because there's too much anxiety production around no prohibitions. The problem is, sorry, I'm off. You got me excited. I've got too much to say. But one of the problems is that there is no way to go back to the God of prohibition. That's the argument of Todd McGowan. I think it's very true. And a good example of this is whenever you get, because Christianity, confessional Christianity is conservative Christian confessional Christianity is often where people go when they can't cope with the excessive enjoyment of like, say, living in LA, right? You end up conservative, because the conservative says, for example, sex within the confines of marriage. So that's a prohibition. God, brilliant, right? This, freely available sex becomes very unsexual, right? So a prohibition, it's like, oh, I need a prohibition. There's a prohibition, no sex before marriage, right? But how is it sold to us? It's sold to us as this is the way to get more enjoyment, right? Have sex within marriage because that's the way to really enjoy it. In other words, even the prohibition is in the frame of the demand to enjoy. So people like Mark Driscoll and others, their profound prohibitionary language is still in the service of the God of enjoyment. All right. That's kind of fascism. Well, it ends up being a bit fascistic, which is the enjoyment of the prohibition itself, right? The Nazis have almost this very sexualized uniforms and all that. Like, there's the enjoyment of the prohibition itself. That's why that never works. The conservative, I like conservatives, intellectual, honest conservatives, because they see the problems within the society, the demand to enjoy. But for me, their prescription is incorrect. Right. So that's why I think even on YouTube, conservatives are often better at seeing the problems within contemporary kind of like liberal society, progressive society. Someone like C.S. Lewis's critique of modern society was very good, very insightful. It's just their solutions are, I think, fundamentally a problem. I was waffling there, but the society of man to enjoy creates fragmentation, creates more of a fantasy of private enjoyment. You're absolutely right. But the issue is it never works. Yes, because we can't privately enjoy. If we become pure private enjoyers, we become deeply depressed, deeply unhappy, really, really awful. So we have to find a way to, and for me, the way is a divided God, right? The God who is also divided, that's the way, is to reestablish communal solidarity. Sorry, I was waffled on a lot of things. Do you want to come back on any of that for a second, and then Sawyer?
No, I think that, I mean, I think especially like putting it in the ways of like these different gods, I think, and when I talk to people about it, I think that like really gets at the root of the issue, is that they really are trying to frame things within the demand to enjoy. And I guess having these conversations with people, if you can conceptually get them to imagine maybe a different kind of God, that's gonna really like cut them in the way that could make this change happen.
Because by the way, like things like OnlyFans and stuff like that is my reading of something like OnlyFans is partly that we are increasingly in a society where we're afraid of the toxicity of the other. So we're more and more frightened of the other in their toxic singularity. So we more and more will want to have contractual relationships that protect us from the toxicity of the other. So for example, sexual encounters where you can pay a certain amount of money, you get something in return, and you're protected from the dangers of flirting and having sexual encounter with the other. So that's partly privatizing. So it's privatizing in the sense of more and more protection from the toxicity of the other. And of course, the problem with that is it's deeply destructive to society, but we're seeing all these solutions, technological solutions, which are really attempts to make a solution to the toxic other. Sawyer, you had your hand up. Anybody else, by the way, stick your hand up if you want to say something so I can see your hand, I can jump to you. Okay, or just jump in. But Sawyer, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly, I was just curious, because you're talking about this like solution, not as a return, but as a movement, this idea of undivided God. But I'm wondering also, like, if you, I'm just thinking about like Foucault and ideas of like new forms of subjectivity and micro resistances. It's kind of a response to. I'm wondering how if that fits into what you're talking about, or if you have a critique of that. If you kind of try, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of Foucault in general, or in particular, his notion
of the solution to, I guess, like power structures as individuals creating new forms of subjectivity as a response. So not necessarily like there's a return, or we know if I'm kind of understanding his ideas properly, like there's not a return to prohibition. There's not a full embrace of enjoyment, but there's acting in response or in rebellion to the dominant power structure as a way to sort of create new forms of subjectivity. But it's not a return, because it kind of can't be in what you're saying, because kind of based on like your I forgot the example you used, but are the ways in which we conceive of prohibition now is just there's enjoyment somewhere down that line.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. So I'm not a big fan of Foucault, and because he's very, he doesn't like the idea of the unconscious. He's very critical of psychoanalysis, and so I'm not as. But I feel like it would be very difficult for me to access all my critiques of Foucault, which are there from like 20 years ago. And what I will say might not be fair to Foucault, because, as I say, I'm accessing files from a long time ago. But I'd be interested, because of his concern with his rejection of the kind of Freudian unconscious. I wonder if I remember, I felt Foucault was his kind of ideas of these micro resistances kind of actually fall into the earlier critique we were talking about, that sometimes these micro resistances are precisely what the power structure needs in order to continue to function. And I was never as convinced with Foucault's kind of political kind of like the consequences, but I feel like you're going to make me do some reading. I'm going to go back and start thinking about my Foucault again.
Yeah, I think it's hard, because there's always a way to sort of redraw that, like refit things into structure in some ways. And so I kind of agree with you. I was just curious if you had.
Yeah. By the way, Alison, you were nodding your head when I was talking about the toxicity of the other. Do you have anything you wanted to say about that, or just where you were nodding your head? You don't have to say anything, but
Nothing to add, but that I was very much amused by that reference point.
oh yeah. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I thought that because you were smiling and nodding your head. So, so yeah, because yeah, it's very much. I do want to do more on that, but I have noticed this, and I honestly think the COVID also played into it, because we're literally talking about a physical germ, like as in the actual, there's actual fear of the other, getting too close, stay 6 feet apart, whatever. That's one thing. Technological purity, as in creating spaces technologically where you hang out with people who are like yourself and separate from people who are not like you, and then also, politically, there's, but and sexually, there are things like OnlyFans. There's just, it seems like there's a lot of things going on where, sadly, a perfect storm of where we're living in a society where increasingly we are, as Chandler was saying, kind of privatizing ourselves more and more. There's less of a commons, and this could be a very dangerous thing.
Well, I
Augustine,
suppose what it ties back to,
go ahead.
Can I just finish that thought? Okay, so what it kind of ties back to is what you were saying about commodification, because a lot of times the transactions that you're having on OnlyFans is there's like a team of people that are, online at certain times of day so that they can respond within the, ideal time frame of, immediate responses, engaged interactions, and all that, just to continue to keep the person, the subscriber, still interested.
Yes. I know, and I don't know, I think we all feel this. Maybe I'm just, I don't think I'm madness. I do feel in the last 5 years increasingly concerned with interactions. So I think it's in the air, whether it's real or not. We can say it doesn't matter. It's real in the sense of it's in our heads, it's in our minds, and there are various technologies that are kind of playing into that, to try to kind of give us, Shizak talks about coffee without caffeine, war without casualties. This is, OnlyFans is sex without sex, right? So but we're trying to kind of, in a sense, have the thing without the dangerous dimension of the thing, which kind of makes sense. But of course, there's the dangerous dimension of the other that is also where all the enjoyment is. And by the way, I know we've gone over time. I'll just say one more thing on that, and please feel free to just to duck out if you need to duck out. But for Freud, and particularly Lacan, Freud called the unknown dimension of the other the Das Ding. He called it, so Das Ding, and I love the phrase because it's so harsh. It's got the thing, Das Ding. Das Ding is the unknown dimension of basically the mother, or the mother other, which is this dimension of the other that is both so alluring and so terrifying. Is the other's desire, and where do I fit within the other's desire, and what do they want of me? And it's both really mesmerizing and really terrifying. And Das Ding is connected to this other thing, object A, which is an adulthood, this experience of the Das Ding. But what we often are trying to do is protect ourselves from the Das Ding of the other, their unknown desire, the dimension of the other that is kind of terrifying and all-consuming. And Richard Boothby at Wake did this beautiful talk on how he basically said that Jesus's command, love your enemy, is really a sense of an invitation into loving the Das Ding of the other, which almost means to be able to tolerate the unknown desire of the other and not hide from it and somehow tarry with it. It's a beautiful rendition of that. Oh, by the way, last night I was talking to a friend who said, in my Q&A last week, somebody asked about Jesus, and I said, I don't talk very much about Jesus, but in my work, but here's what I think. And then he said that for the next 5 minutes, the sound went off as I said everything I thought about Jesus, and then just as I finished, it started again. So I created this, and then I said, and so that's what I think. So I quite like that. If that's true, I think that's really, really good. I didn't plan that, but yes, that's my thing about Jesus. Is Jesus was kind of inviting us to love the neighbor and even the enemy, which is this toxic dimension of the other. That technology is promising we can get rid of. We can get rid of so the other is a reflection of ourselves, and the really other is an enemy that we can cut out of society and not have to engage with at all. And the demand of Jesus is, no, love your enemy. If your mother or father, you think that their views are terrible, sit down with them and have a drink with them and be in the presence of that unknown desire that they have. Any final comment? Oh, Courtney, come on and you do the final comment or thought or question.
Well, I'm hoping you will do the final comment. Sorry, I'm talking so much.
No.
I just wanted to share real quick. There's a really fantastic episode of the original Star Trek where the crew comes to a planet where they're waging war, but it's all done via computer. And the computer calculates, well, this side A, let's say, made a strike against side B, and side B has this many casualties. So in that country or that continent or whatever, let's say 10,000 casualties, 10,000 people voluntarily go to have themselves executed. And it's, I mean, completely bloodless. They're just kind of vaporized painlessly. Completely bloodless war, completely weaponless war. And yet these people are so locked into it that they can't get out of it. I've always thought that that's just the most fascinating and horrible,
Yes.
horrible thing. Second, somebody in the chat has a question saying, Pete, how do you explain Jesus being divided? Can you say something about that?
Oh yeah, so I didn't look at the chat box. Thank you for saying that. And if there's anything else in the chat box, let me know before the end. that was worth saying. So not Christ divided, Christ crucified, but particularly Jesus, the figure of Jesus. Is that, yeah, I'm guessing. So the one of the reasons very quickly why I have not done as much on Jesus in recent years and have spent much more time in this notion of Christ is that it is the notion of God dying, of Christ crucified, is such a philosophically and theologically rich idea and politically rich idea. So I've really concentrated on that idea that in Christ crucified, you get the idea of the eternal and the temporal together, that the God and humanity, and this, my God, why have you forsaken me? This kind of experience within God of self-division. So that's why Christ has been very interesting to me. And it's harder to weave that into the gospel stories of Jesus. So I've kind of like done less on Jesus. But what Richard Boothby has done, and this is where I'm kind of excited about doing a book study of his, and I'll put up his talk in the next couple of weeks on YouTube, is his argument is the most innovative thing about Jesus. Like what? Because I'm interested in what makes certain figures radical, right? Not what makes them the same as everybody else, but what's different. And one of the things about Jesus is potentially that what Richard Boothby argues is in Greek religion, you have the notion of the otherness of the universe, the otherness, the mystery of reality is behind, we can't get access to it. So we got all these crazy myths. The Greeks didn't really believe the myths. The myths are kind of like anthropological kind of attempts to make sense of what is utterly impossible for us to make sense of, right? So that's the imaginary. You get within, say, Judaism, this incredible notion of God, the other, as utterly inaccessible, and you can't make graven images. And what you have is the symbolic, the law. You have the covenants. You have that. And what Boothby says that in Jesus, what you have is the notion that. So these are different ways to relate to this otherness, to this absolute otherness. And he said the interesting thing about Jesus, who's a Jew, is that he says that this otherness is in your neighbor and in your enemy. So this otherness is is the way to encounter God is to encounter your neighbor. And so I think that's right. So if I do, which I will do probably in 2023, a series of seminars on Jesus, the figure of Jesus, basically the punchline will be this. It will be that the radicality of the message of Jesus is that the encounter with this radical asymmetry of the universe, this otherness that is part of reality, this otherness that is infused in everything, our way of encountering that is through our love of the other, nothing else. It is a religion of the love of the other. And so that's, I don't know if that helps, if I'm answering the question or not, but definitely the Richard Boothby talk's worth listening to. Okay, I would love to keep going because this is really fun, but leave them wanting more. That's the thing. This goes on forever, so we're going to do this again next month. So thanks so much for being part of this. I really enjoyed it. I didn't have anything to bring. Oh, Chris, go for it. Did you want to say something? Oh no, somebody said something.
No, I did. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about, this is unrelated to what we've been talking about.
Oh, yeah.
We had talked about catamarans. I'm going to put a link right there, and you'll enjoy this, by the way. In fact, if go watch that, you'll get a kick.
Okay, I'm gonna have to copy it because as soon as I close this down, I'm gonna lose it. So give me a second. I'm gonna, because I've done this before where I've closed it down and then I realize that you can't get access to any of the chat. So okay, I'll watch that.
Pete, while you're just copying, can I jump in just very quickly to say that for anyone who is around next week, if they want to come to this link at this time, so 11:30 PST, then we're going to have a session where we're discussing and planning doing a transformance art event online in the coming few weeks and putting it together as a community group. So if anyone's interested, then don't feel like you have to sign up or inform anyone, just turn up next week and we'll have a discussion. Mary Beth, I know you sent me an email about it. So rather than replying to your email, I will just tell you now.
Wonderful, thank you. And for anyone who's in LA, I know Amy, you're close. Sunday, the 31st, hanging out at High Def. But yeah, this has been a very, very enjoyable little coffee and concept. So I think this is the model for how to do things as we move forward. Thank you so much for being part of it, and I'll see you all very soon.
It was very good, Peter.
Thank you.